Close your eyes, listen. Before the empires, before the stone cities, before the borders that define our world today, there was only the wind. This is the sound of the Eurasian Steppe. It is an ocean of grass that stretches until it touches the sky. A vast, undulating expanse that seems to breathe with the rhythm of the universe itself. For thousands of years, this place was not a place of division. It was not a landscape to be carved up or conquered. It was the world's greatest sanctuary. We have been told stories of this place. Stories written by those who stood at the edges, looking in with fear and misunderstanding. They told us tales of chaos, of nomadic instability, of people who lived in the shadow of civilization. But they were wrong. They were looking at the surface, never understanding the rhythm below. They saw the absence of walls as an absence of order, failing to realize that the most profound order is the one that exists in harmony with the natural world. To understand the people of the steppe, the Scythians, you must unlearn the idea of home. In our modern life, we are taught that home is where we plant our feet. We are taught that success is measured by the stability of our foundations, the durability of our structures, and the permanence of our presence. We build walls to keep the world out, and we anchor ourselves to the earth, convinced that to be stationary is to be secure. But for the nomads of the steppe, home was not a place. Home was a cycle. It was the movement of the sun, the migration of the herds, the turning of the seasons. It was a philosophy of existence that recognized the truth of the universe, that everything is in motion, that everything is fleeting, and that to fight against the current of change is to fight against life itself. They lived in harmony with the great breathing earth. They understood what we have forgotten, that to stand still is to stagnate, but to move is to evolve. They were the poets of the horizon. Imagine waking up every morning in a different corner of the world. Imagine seeing the sunrise from a different horizon, feeling the wind from a different direction, knowing that your existence is entirely dependent on your ability to read the signs of nature. It creates a clarity of mind that the modern world rarely affords us. It strips away the anxieties of the future and the regrets of the past, leaving only the imperative of the present moment. They were always exactly where they needed to be, at the exact time they needed to be there. They did not drag the earth along with them. They traveled with the earth. They were not just moving through space. They were moving through a spiritual landscape where every river, every hill, and every cloud was a teacher. For centuries, their gold was buried in the frost. Their stories were woven into intricate tattoos that decorated their skin like maps of the spirit. We have uncovered their tombs. We have gazed upon their art, and we have been awestruck by the sophistication of their world. But their true legacy is not found in the metal they crafted, or the mounds they raised. It is found in the stillness they cultivated. They were never conquered because they never stood to be conquered. They were fluid. They were ephemeral. They understood that the strongest thing in nature is not the mountain that resists the storm, but the grass that bows before it. In this journey, we will not look for ghosts of battles. We will not seek the dust of fallen kingdoms or the echoes of conflict. We will seek the wisdom that allowed a people to thrive in the harshest cradle of nature. We will seek the Scythian spirit, a spirit that reminds us that we, too, are only travelers passing through the infinite. The ancient world was a place of deep connection, a place where humanity felt itself to be a thread in a much larger tapestry. The Scythians were the ones who kept that tapestry strong. They were the bridge between the civilizations of the East and the West, the carriers of ideas, the silent observers of the rise and fall of empires. While others spent their lives obsessed with the accumulation of power, the nomads of the steppe spent their lives cultivating a relationship with the divine, a relationship expressed in the beauty of their art and the sanctity of their movement. As we step into this world, I invite you to set aside the noise of your daily life. I invite you to leave behind the static nature of your existence and to embrace, if only for a moment, the fluidity of the nomad. We are going back to a time when the world was vast and full of mystery, We are going back to a time when the human soul was not caged by geography or defined by occupation. We are going back to the Golden Steppe. Welcome to the sanctuary of the forgotten. Welcome to the infinite silence. The tragedy of our modern age is not that we have lost the ability to travel, but that we have lost the ability to truly arrive. We move from place to place with frantic speed, our minds occupied by the destinations we have yet to reach, our hearts burdened by the places we have left behind. We treat our lives like a race toward a finish line that perpetually recedes into the distance. But the nomad knew that life is not a destination. Life is the way in which we travel. When we study the Scythians, we are not looking back at a primitive past. We are looking forward to a forgotten possibility. We are looking at a way of existing that prioritized the integrity of the individual over the requirements of the state, a way of living that honored the sanctity of the animal as much as the sanctity of the human. They teach us that civilization does not have to mean the corruption of our spirit. They teach us that we can be sophisticated, that we can create beauty, that we can engage with the world without sacrificing our soul to the grind of industry or the hunger of ambition. This is the promise of the Golden Steppe. It is an invitation to inhabit a space where the air is still clean, where the horizon is unencumbered, and where the human heart can beat in synchronicity with the earth. It is an opportunity to reclaim a part of ourselves that has been buried under the weight of expectations and the noise of our current reality. As we traverse this long story, let the speed of your life slow to the pace of a grazing herd. Let your thoughts settle like dust after a migration. Do not worry about the timeline. Do not worry about the history book facts that you might think you need to memorize. That is for the academic. For us, this is an act of remembrance. We are remembering a state of grace. We are remembering what it feels like to belong entirely to the present. So, let the silence of the steppe settle into your consciousness. Let the story of the Scythians wash over you, not as information to be consumed, but as wisdom to be experienced. They were the keepers of the rhythm, the guardians of the infinite silence, and they are waiting to tell us what they saw, what they felt, and what they knew. The path is open, the steppe is vast, and the journey at last begins. To the Scythian, time was not a straight line, marked by the ticking of clocks or the turning of rigid calendars. Time was a wheel. It was a breathing process, a pulsation that moved through the world like the tide in an ocean. Imagine living a life where you never had to conquer the earth to survive, but only to listen to it. For the nomads of the steppe, the year did not begin on a fixed date or with the harvest of crops defined by the demands of a king. It began when the grass changed its hue. When the first shoots of emerald emerged through the melting frost, the steppe whispered a message. It is time. This was not a command from a ruler, but an invitation from the land itself. The migration was the heartbeat of their civilization. It was the rhythm that kept them in balance. Where others saw a vast, empty wilderness, the Scythians saw a map of survival, a map written in the flight of birds, the migration of herds, and the changing of the winds. They did not drag the earth along with them. They traveled with the earth. Think about the philosophy of this movement. In our world, we measure success by how much ground we can claim, how many fences we can build, and how many barriers we can erect to keep the world out. We are tethered to the static. We are convinced that to be stationary is to be secure. But the Scythians were tethered only to the infinite. By remaining fluid, by never clinging to one specific patch of soil, they maintained a perspective that is almost impossible for us to comprehend today. They saw the landscape not as an object to be owned, but as a living host that granted them passage in exchange for their respect. As the sun climbed higher, warming the plains, the movement began. It was not a chaotic exodus. It was a choreographed dance that had been rehearsed for generations. They moved with the seasons, following the path of life. When the summer heat intensified, they moved toward the cooler northern pastures, ensuring that their herds had the freshest graze. When the winter chill crept in, they retreated to the sheltered valleys, where the rivers provided both water and protection from the bite of the frost. There is a profound wisdom in this cycle. By moving, they allowed the earth to heal in their wake. They practiced a kind of stewardship that we have largely forgotten, the stewardship of non-interference. They understood that every living system has a capacity, and that to stay too long is to deplete, but to move on is to replenish. In these months of movement, there was no room for the hoarding of things. You cannot carry the weight of excess when your home must be portable. They owned only what they could use, and they valued only what they could keep in their hearts. This taught them a supreme lesson, that the true measure of a human being is not found in the weight of their possessions, but in the lightness of their journey. Can you imagine the liberation of such a life? To wake up every morning in a different corner of the world, to see the sunrise from a different horizon, to know that your existence is entirely dependent on your ability to read the signs of nature. It creates a clarity of mind that we have traded away for comfort. It strips away the anxieties of the future and the regrets of the past, leaving only the imperative of the present moment. They were always exactly where they needed to be, at the exact time they needed to be there. This was the nomadic rhythm, a life governed by the grace of movement, the integrity of the cycle, and an unwavering respect for the living world that sustained them. As they traveled, they were not just moving through space, they were moving through a spiritual landscape where every river, every hill, and every cloud was a teacher. And as we follow them on this path, we begin to realize that the grass beneath their feet was not just food for their herds. It was a bridge between their physical survival and the quiet, enduring wisdom of the steppe. They were never lost, for they were never trying to reach an end. They were simply living within the cycle, perfectly attuned to the turning of the wheel. To understand the Scythian, you must understand the horse. But we must be careful with the words we use. When we look at history, we often speak of domestication or mastery, as if the human hand had forced the natural world into submission. In the worldview of the steppe, that concept is entirely foreign. The relationship between the nomad and the horse was not one of master and servant. It was a kinship of equals. It was a partnership of souls. For the Scythian, the horse was not merely a tool for transit or an instrument for survival. It was an extension of the self. To be on horseback was to enter into a different mode of existence. It was to elevate one's perspective above the grass, to feel the vibration of the earth through the animal's stride, and to move through the world with a grace that a human body alone could never achieve. They shared the same vast open horizons. They drank from the same cold rivers. They weathered the same storms, huddling together against the biting wind when the winter descended. This bond began long before a rider ever climbed onto a back. It began in the cradle of the camp, where the young were raised alongside the colts. There was no boundary between the human family and the equine family. The horse was a presence, a witness to the daily rituals of migration, a companion in the long, silent hours of grazing. They learned the language of one another, not the language of words, but the language of intention, of body, and of shared breath. In our modern life, we have largely severed our connection to the animal kingdom. We look at animals as objects, resources to be consumed, laborers to be used, or pets to be contained. We have forgotten that for the vast majority of our history, humans and animals existed in a delicate, reciprocal contract. We gave them protection. They gave us their strength. We gave them care. They gave us their freedom. The Scythian horse was free, even when it carried a rider. It was not kept in a stable, bound by walls or chained by iron. It lived with the nomad, roaming the same pastures, drinking from the same streams, and sleeping under the same vast canopy of stars. When the time came to travel, the horse did not need to be coerced. It was part of the migration. It understood the rhythm as intimately as the nomad did. They moved together because they belonged together. There is a profound humility in this. To ride such a creature is to acknowledge that you are not the center of the world. You are merely a passenger, a partner in a journey that is larger than you. When you move in synchronization with an animal, you surrender a part of your ego. You stop trying to control the pace and start trying to feel it. You stop trying to impose your will and start trying to understand the animal's needs, its temperament, and its connection to the environment. This partnership transformed the Scythian spirit. It made them patient, for you cannot rush a horse that has its own understanding of the landscape. It made them observant, for you must always be watching the ears, the gait, and the behavior of your companion to understand what the steppe is signaling, and it made them empathetic, for they knew the suffering of their horses as keenly as their own. When we look back at the art they left behind, the golden plaques, the intricate carvings of stags and horses, we see that this was not just decoration. This was an act of reverence. They were honoring the entities that made their life possible. They were documenting the sacredness of the bond. In their mythology, the horse was often depicted as a psychopomp, a guide for the soul in the journey between worlds. This belief stems directly from their daily life. The horse guided them across the physical world, and so, in their minds, it was only natural that it would guide them across the spiritual one as well. This relationship taught them something else, something that resonates deeply with our need for sanctuary today: trust. You cannot thrive on the steppe if you do not trust your companion. You cannot survive the winter if you do not trust the wisdom of the herd. They lived in an environment that was indifferent to their survival, a place where the elements could be unforgiving. In that vastness, the only thing that kept them anchored was the trust they placed in each other and in the animals that shared their destiny. It is a reminder that we are not meant to walk this world in isolation. We are not meant to face the vastness of life alone, building walls and hoarding resources to feel safe. We are meant to walk in partnership. We are meant to recognize the sanctity of the life that surrounds us, to honor the connections we form, and to understand that our survival is tied to the survival of the world we inhabit. As the sun sets, casting long purple shadows across the grass, the herd gathers. There is a quiet communication, a soft whinny, a gentle nudge, the low sound of chewing. They are at peace. They are home. And in that stillness, we can see the true nature of the nomad. It is not found in the speed of the ride, but in the stillness of the relationship. It is not found in the power of the journey, but in the harmony of the travelers. If home is not a place, but a feeling, then where do you build it? For the nomad, the answer was radical. Home is where you choose to be. We tend to think of architecture in terms of stone, mortar, and permanence. We believe that to build a home is to assert our claim upon the land, to plant a foundation so deep that it becomes a permanent scar on the earth. We measure the success of a civilization by the height of its towers and the thickness of its walls. But the Scythians practiced a different kind of architecture, a living architecture. They built sanctuaries that breathed, homes that were as portable as the wind, and structures that could be dismantled in minutes to leave the steppe exactly as they had found it. Imagine a world where you never have to worry about the maintenance of property, the weight of ownership, or the fear of displacement. For the Scythians, the wagon tent was a miracle of engineering and philosophy. It was a masterpiece of felt and wood, designed not to dominate the landscape, but to integrate seamlessly into it. These were not merely huts. They were circular, protective cocoons that provided safety, warmth, and comfort in the midst of the most unforgiving environments. They were designed to withstand the brutal gales of the steppe, constructed with a flexibility that allowed them to sway with the wind rather than fight it. But the true genius was not just in their durability, it was in their impermanence. This was the ultimate realization of the philosophy of light living. When the season shifted, when the grass turned to gold, the entire village, every home, every hearth, could vanish as silently as a morning mist. They left behind no foundations, no ruins, no lasting disruptions to the delicate ecosystem. They walked through the world, leaving only the memory of their passing. In our modern age, we have become obsessed with stability. We surround ourselves with objects that anchor us to one specific coordinate on a map. We fill our houses with things we do not need, and we spend our lives in the service of maintaining that clutter. We have built our identities around the objects we own and the spaces we occupy. The Scythians were the antithesis of this. They taught that the lighter you travel, the further you can go. They understood that the more you own, the more you are owned by your possessions. This was not poverty. It was a profound form of wealth. By stripping their lives down to the essential, they gained an unimaginable freedom. They were not held captive by the upkeep of a mansion or the tax of a land plot. They were free to follow the light, to chase the changing seasons, and to seek out the places where the spirit felt most at ease. Their homes were an extension of their path, a vessel for their journey, and a symbol of their detachment from the idea of static ownership. Consider the psychological impact of living in a circular space that can be packed away at will. There are no corners in which to hide, no hallways that lead to isolation, and no walls that feel like a cage. Everything is central, everything is shared, and everything is connected. It is a design that naturally fosters community and intimacy. Within these circular sanctuaries, the hearth was the beating heart, the space where stories were told, wisdom was passed down, and the collective soul of the tribe was nurtured. The architecture itself dictated a life of communal harmony. There is a lesson here for all of us, living in our rigid, permanent boxes, surrounded by our accumulation of things. The Scythian way of living challenges us to ask, what do I really need to be whole? If I had to carry my life on the back of a wagon, what would I keep? What would I leave behind? Perhaps light living is not just about the size of our home or the weight of our belongings. It is about the lightness of our attachment. It is about cultivating an interior space that is so vast, so rich, and so stable that you do not need the external world to provide you with a sense of security. The Scythians were at home everywhere, not because they conquered every place they visited, but because they understood that home is a portable sanctuary of the heart. As the sun dips below the horizon, painting the steppe in hues of fire and amethyst, the circular tents begin to glow from within. The nomadic community, gathered around the fire, exists in a state of grace. They have no permanent address, no static monument to their ego, and no burden of ownership. They are simply people, living in accordance with the earth, finding their sanctuary in the temporary, and discovering that when you are not trying to possess the world, you are free to belong to it. There exists a belief among many peoples that gold is a measure of wealth, a symbol of power, a commodity to be hoarded and guarded in vaults. But to the Scythian, gold was something far more profound. It was a language. It was a conversation with the divine. When we examine the artifacts that have survived the centuries, the golden plaques, the intricate animal figurines, the delicate ornaments that adorned their clothing and vessels, we are not looking at treasures meant to be locked away. We are looking at prayers rendered in metal. We are witnessing the materialization of the spiritual world into physical form. The Scythian goldsmith was not a mere craftsperson. He was a mystic, a translator of visions, and a bridge between the seen and the unseen. When he sat at his forge, surrounded by heat and shadow, he was not simply shaping metal. He was channeling something that existed beyond himself. The act of creation was a sacred ritual, as important as any ceremony performed at dawn or dusk. Consider the stag. In Scythian imagery, the stag appears again and again, leaping, poised, eternal. It is not a random choice. The stag was a symbol of the wild spirit, the untamed essence of the natural world. It represented the bridge between the earthly realm and the celestial one. When a Scythian artisan crafted a stag from gold, he was not creating a decoration. He was creating a talisman, an anchor point for the soul's journey. These were objects meant to be worn, touched, and carried into the spiritual world when the body passed from this one. The craftsmanship itself was extraordinary. The Scythians understood metallurgy as intimately as they understood the migration patterns of birds. They knew how to heat gold to precise temperatures, how to work it with a delicacy that made it seem alive, how to create forms that captured movement frozen in time. Each piece was a meditation on form and emptiness, on the seen and the unseen. But what is most remarkable is that these pieces were not created to display status or to broadcast wealth. In fact, many of the most exquisite golden objects were never meant to be seen by living eyes. They were buried with the dead, offerings to guide the soul on its journey to the next realm. Some were worn as amulets, hidden beneath clothing, kept close to the heart as a private conversation with the divine. Others were melted down and reworked, their forms transformed but their spiritual essence preserved. This practice reveals a profound truth about the Scythian worldview, that the value of a thing is not determined by how much it costs or how many people admire it, but by the intention it carries and the spiritual work it performs. Gold, to them, was not an end in itself. It was a medium. It was a way of making the invisible visible, of creating an object that could hold meaning across the threshold between worlds. In our modern age, we have reduced gold to its monetary value. We hoard it, we trade it, we measure our worth in its weight. But in doing so, we have forgotten its original purpose. Gold is one of the few materials that does not tarnish, does not decay, and does not diminish with time. It is incorruptible. To the Scythian, this quality made it sacred. It was the perfect medium for capturing something eternal. When they placed a golden ornament into a tomb, they were ensuring that the message, the prayer, the blessing, the spiritual intention, would survive intact, untouched by time, ready to protect and guide the soul for eternity. The goldsmith, then, was not creating art for art's sake. He was performing a sacred duty. He was translating the inner vision of his people into a form that could outlast them, that could carry their wisdom forward into the future, that could speak to those who came after them in a language that transcends words. As we hold these artifacts in our minds, as we imagine the Scythian craftsmen working late into the night, coaxing gold into the shape of a soaring eagle or a sacred tree, we begin to understand that art was never meant to be a luxury for the privileged. Art was survival. Art was the way they kept their souls alive. If the golden stag was the prayer, the mythology was the map. For the Scythian, the world was not a blank canvas waiting to be inscribed with human history, but a profound living narrative that had existed long before they arrived and would endure long after they departed. Their myths were not merely stories told to pass the time. They were the compass by which they oriented their entire existence within the vastness of the steppe. To understand their sacred narrative, one must first let go of the idea of a hierarchy. In many traditions, there is a clear division between the human realm and the divine, a chasm that must be bridged by temple, priest, or prayer. But for the Scythian, that division did not exist. The divine was not somewhere else. It was right here, woven into the very fabric of the landscape. The earth was not a resource. It was the mother, Tabiti, whose hearth fire warmed the heart of every tent. The sky was the father, the boundless expanse that oversaw the cycle of birth and return. Their gods were not characters in a distant epic. They were the forces of nature that dictated their survival. When the wind whistled across the open plains, it was a voice. When the river surged with the spring melt, it was a manifestation of renewal. When the sun reached its zenith, it was a sign of the life force in its most potent state. Their mythology was a way of articulating their deep, elemental relationship with these forces. It was a language of reciprocity. If they respected the hearth, Tabiti would protect them. If they honored the cycle of the sun, the seasons would turn in their favor. Yet perhaps the most misunderstood archetype in the Scythian narrative is that of the hero. When we look at history through the lens of other cultures, The hero is almost always defined by the conflict they resolve, the monsters they slay, or the armies they lead to victory. But the Scythian hero was defined by something altogether different. They were pathfinders. The Scythian hero was not an agent of conquest, but an agent of awakening. They were the individuals who, through deep listening and communion with the natural world, revealed hidden truths. They were the ones who understood the language of the birds, the wisdom embedded in the migration of the animals, or the secrets carried by the currents of the rivers. Their power lay not in the strength of their arm, but in the clarity of their vision. They were the listeners, the observers, the ones who could see the threads of connectivity that held the cosmos together and bring that understanding back to the tribe. This mythic framework suggests a worldview centered on harmony rather than dominance. The stories that were told around the communal fires were not about how one person imposed their will upon another, but about how one person learned to align their will with the unfolding wisdom of the world. It was a narrative of alignment. The hero's journey, in this context, was the process of shedding the ego, of letting go of the illusions of separation, and becoming fully, vibrantly attuned to the pulse of the steppe. This perspective reveals a profound wisdom about how we navigate our own lives. We often view our challenges as monsters to be defeated, as enemies to be overcome, or as problems to be solved. We look for a heroic path that involves fighting against the reality of our circumstances. But the Scythian myth offers an alternative. What if the heroic path is not one of conflict, but one of receptivity? What if the most courageous act is to sit still, to observe, and to align yourself with the currents that are already carrying you? Their mythology was a map of the soul's capacity to endure, to adapt, and to harmonize. It taught them that the cosmos is a wheel, and that every aspect of life, every joy, every hardship, every season, has its necessary place. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is permanent. By embedding this understanding into their sacred stories, they ensured that their people were never lost. They were always oriented within the cycle. They were always tethered to the infinite. As we look toward the horizon, we can imagine the nomad listening to these myths. They are not hearing about how to gain more, or how to conquer more, or how to leave a more lasting mark upon the world. They are hearing about how to live in resonance with the world as it is. They are hearing about the beauty of the return, the sacredness of the cycle, and the eternal validity of a life lived in balance. This is the power of the sacred narrative. It does not try to solve the mystery of life. It teaches us how to live within it. It transforms the vast, potentially terrifying openness of the steppe into a home. It transforms the indifference of nature into a conversation. And ultimately, it reminds us that we too are part of the story, that our lives are not isolated incidents, but beautiful, fleeting verses in an endless celestial song. If the mythology was the map, then the rituals of daily life were the footsteps taken along that path. We often harbor a misconception that ritual is something sequestered, something reserved for special days, sacred spaces, or the oversight of a designated priest. We imagine that to be spiritual, one must retreat from the world. But for the Scythian, spirituality was not a retreat. It was an integration. Their rituals were not performed instead of living. They were the way they lived. The true genius of the Scythian spirit lay in their ability to turn the mundane into the meaningful. They understood that the sacred is not a place you visit. It is a way of paying attention. Consider the simple act of preparing the hearth. In the cold, vast openness of the steppe, the fire was the physical survival of the tribe. But it was also a conversation. Every morning, as the embers were stirred back into flame, it was not merely a chore of heating water or preparing food. It was an invocation of Tabiti, the goddess of the home. It was a conscious recognition of warmth as a gift, a realization that life is a flame that must be tended with care, patience, and humility. This act of tending the fire taught them something essential about their own existence, that the energy they brought into their tasks determined the quality of their lives. If they stirred the fire with anger or haste, the warmth felt fragile. If they stirred it with gratitude and intention, the warmth felt nourishing. Every task, no matter how small, was an opportunity to practice presence. We live in a culture that often views mundane tasks as obstacles, as things to be completed quickly so that we can get to the real parts of our day. We spend our lives rushing toward a future that never truly arrives. The Scythian way invites us to reverse this. What if the real part of your day is not the destination, but the path? What if the ritual is not the fire itself, but the act of stirring it? They applied this same reverence to every aspect of their existence. When they mended a piece of leather, they did not do so with the frustration of someone repairing a broken tool. They did so with the grace of someone honoring an object that had served them well. Mending was a form of gratitude. It was a recognition that all things, whether animal, plant, or object, had a cycle, and that to extend the life of an item was to honor the life that had been given to create it. It was a rejection of the disposable, a profound commitment to the integrity of their existence. Perhaps the most powerful of their rituals was the ritual of silence. In the modern world, we are surrounded by a relentless noise. We are bombarded by the opinions of others, the demands of the clock, and the constant digital stream of distraction. The Scythians had the silence of the steppe, an expansive, terrifying, and beautiful void. But they did not fill that silence. They cultivated it. There were moments, particularly at the edges of the day, when the entire tribe would simply stop. They would step out of the circle of the tents and stand on the open plain, observing the changing light, listening to the vast, hollow sound of the wind, and breathing in the stillness. This was not a passive act. It was an active, intentional alignment. In those moments of reflection, they were not thinking about the next migration or the condition of the herds. They were simply letting go. They were practicing the art of being a witness to their own lives. This ritual of reflection was their most effective tool for maintaining mental and spiritual balance. By consciously stepping away from the doing of life, they created space for the being. They recognized that you cannot see the stars if you are looking at your own feet. You cannot hear the wisdom of the world if you are only listening to your own thoughts. This teaches us a profound lesson. We believe that we are defined by our actions, by what we produce, what we achieve, and what we possess. But the Scythians taught that we are defined by our capacity to reflect. The beauty of the golden stag, the depth of the sacred narrative. These things only have meaning if there is a space within us to receive them. Ultimately, their rituals were a way of keeping the ego in check. When you realize that your morning tea is a sacred offering, that your clothes are a testament to the life of the world around you, and that the silence is your most important teacher, the ego begins to dissolve. You stop trying to stand above the world and start trying to stand within it. As we look at the life of the nomad, we see that they did not need a temple to find the divine. They found it in the way they tied their boots, in the way they poured the water, in the way they listened to the wind. They turned the ordinary into an act of devotion, and in doing so, they revealed the secret that we have spent centuries trying to find, that the sacred is not something you go out to find. It is something you bring to everything you do. If the previous chapters of this journey explored the Scythian soul, their art, their mythology, and their intimate daily rituals, we must now turn our gaze outward to the collective body of their people. How did a culture, bound by the unforgiving rhythm of migration and the vastness of the horizon, organize itself without falling into the trap of rigid, oppressive structures? How does a society remain whole when it is constantly in motion? The answer, written into the very layout of their camps, was the circle. When a Scythian tribe paused for the night, they did not lay out their tents in lines or grids. They did not create hierarchical avenues leading to the dwelling of a central ruler. Instead, they formed a circle. This was not an aesthetic choice. It was a profound social and spiritual statement. A circle has no beginning and no end. It has no central point of absolute authority that stands above the others. In a circle, every voice has a path to every other voice. Every person is equidistant from the center, and every person is connected to the whole. To the Scythian mind, power was not a commodity to be hoarded by the few. It was not a weight to be carried by a king or a crown to be passed down through lines of blood. Power, in their view, was a dynamic force that belonged to the community as a whole. It was expressed through wisdom, experience, and the ability to listen. Their society functioned on a foundation of consensus. When a decision needed to be made, whether it was time to move the herds to higher ground, how to navigate a diplomatic encounter, or how to manage a shared resource, the tribe did not rely on the edict of a singular commander. They gathered. They sat in that circle. This was not a process of debate in the adversarial sense that we often understand it today. It was not a process designed for one side to win and the other to lose. It was a process of weaving. Each elder, each youth, each person who had earned the respect of the group through their character and contributions added their perspective to the tapestry. They spoke, and crucially, they listened. They understood that the truth was not held by one person, but was a complex, multifaceted thing that could only be perceived if all perspectives were gathered together. This structure allowed them to remain remarkably resilient. Because authority was decentralized, the tribe was not dependent on the health, the wisdom, or the temperament of a single leader. If an elder passed on, the collective wisdom of the community remained. If a specific path became blocked, they had 1,000 minds capable of envisioning a new one. Their strength was not found in the rigidity of an iron-fisted ruler, but in the flexibility of a connected community. This concept of decentralized power is often difficult for the modern observer to grasp. We have been trained to believe that order requires command. We believe that if you do not have a boss, a captain, or a king, you have chaos. But the Scythians proved that true order comes from alignment, not control. When people are deeply connected to the purpose of their community, when they understand the rhythm of their environment, and when they feel their voice is valued, they do not need to be coerced into acting for the greater good. They do it because it is the natural expression of their existence. The authority of the elders within this system was not granted, it was earned. It was an authority of service. The elder did not hold power over the tribe, they held the history of the tribe. They carried the memory of previous migrations, the knowledge of the stars, and the wisdom of the myths. Their role was not to issue commands, but to hold the space within which the community could find its own way. They were the anchors, the memory keepers who ensured that even in the midst of change, the tribe did not lose its identity. This fostered a profound sense of responsibility within every member of the community. In a hierarchical system, responsibility is often delegated upward. If something goes wrong, you blame the leader. If something goes right, you credit the leader. In the Scythian circle, responsibility was distributed horizontally. Everyone was a stakeholder in the survival of the group. Everyone was a contributor to the well-being of the whole. This social structure created a unique atmosphere of freedom. Because they were not burdened by the demands of a centralized state, no taxes to pay for monumental construction, no soldiers to be conscripted for endless wars of conquest, no intricate legal codes enforced by external authorities. They were free to live in alignment with their own values. They were free to be themselves, while still being part of something larger. As we imagine them in that gathering, that circle of equals, we can see the beauty of their social arrangement. There is no urgency to dominate, no anxiety about status, no fear of being excluded. There is only the quiet, rhythmic act of coming together to ensure that the journey continues, that the herds are fed, and that the stories are passed on. They taught us that the most enduring societies are not those built on the strength of their walls or the power of their decrees, but on the strength of their connections. They taught us that when you remove the weight of hierarchy, you do not get chaos. You get a deeper, more profound form of order. an order that breathes, that moves, and that grows. To view the Scythian social circle through the lens of modern hierarchy is to misunderstand the very foundation of their existence. History, written largely by civilizations that favored strict patriarchal structures, has often struggled to categorize the role of Scythian women. They have been relegated to footnotes, mythologized into one-dimensional figures, or simply erased. Yet, if we return to the circle, that profound living arrangement of equality, we begin to see that women were not merely present in the Scythian narrative, they were its architects. In the Scythian worldview, the preservation of the community was not a task divided into men's work and women's work. Survival on the open steppe required total participation. However, if one looks closely at the evidence left behind in the burial mounds and within the oral traditions that survived, a distinct truth emerges. The wisdom of the women was the anchor of the tribe. While the men were often responsible for the movement of the herds and the physical maintenance of the migration routes, the women were the keepers of the deep memory. They held the knowledge of the land, the timing of the seasons, and the complex spiritual lore that governed their interactions with the divine. They were the healers, the astronomers, and the strategic thinkers. When the tribe faced a moment of crisis, a shift in the climate, a scarcity of resources, or the need for a new path forward, it was the wisdom of the women that often provided the decisive clarity. The misconception that has plagued our understanding of these women is the fascination with the martial myth. We have been conditioned to see them through the eyes of the ancient Greeks, who looked at the independent, capable women of the steppe and saw only a terrifying inversion of their own social order. They focused on the myth of the warrior. But what if we reframe that archetype? What if the protective nature of these women was not about conflict, but about the preservation of the sacred? To protect the culture was to protect the continuity of the tribe. They were the ones who ensured that the sacred narratives were passed down without corruption. They were the ones who safeguarded the rituals of reflection that kept the community in balance. They were the ones who understood that the true strength of a people lies not in their ability to conquer, but in their ability to remember who they are. This role required a form of intellectual agency that was rare in the ancient world. Scythian women participated in the councils. They offered counsel on matters of migration and diplomacy, and they possessed a social status that was remarkably high. This was not a concession granted by men. It was a natural consequence of a society that valued wisdom above all else. If you are a culture that revolves around migration and the management of resources across a vast, unpredictable landscape, you cannot afford to waste half of your intellectual potential. You need every mind, every voice, and every perspective. The wisdom of the women was also deeply tied to their understanding of cycles. Just as the land had its seasons of fertility and its seasons of dormancy, the life of a tribe had its moments of growth and its moments of contraction. The women understood, perhaps better than anyone, that there is wisdom in patience. They knew that there are times to act, but there are also times to wait, to observe, and to align. They taught the tribe that true power is not always about the loudest voice or the most visible action. True power is found in the quiet, enduring work of maintaining harmony. It is found in the ability to hold a family together through the most difficult winters. It is found in the capacity to read the subtle changes in the environment, the shifting of the wind, the changing color of the grass, that signal the need for change long before that need becomes a catastrophe. In this way, the women were the primary strategists of survival. They were the ones who looked at the horizon not as a boundary to be crossed, but as a living host with which they had to negotiate. Their leadership was not about commanding obedience, but about navigating the delicate balance between the needs of the people and the limits of the land. This ancient model offers a powerful alternative to the stories we have been told about the inevitability of imbalance. It reminds us that a society, or a life, is only as strong as its commitment to internal equality. It teaches us that the exclusion of any voice, or the dismissal of any form of wisdom, is not a sign of strength. It is a fundamental flaw in the structure. As we imagine them, sitting in that circle, their faces illuminated by the hearth fire, we can see the strength of their presence. They are not striving for recognition. They are not seeking to displace anyone. They are simply doing what they have always done, bringing their full, vibrant intelligence to the ongoing task of living. They are a reminder that in a healthy society, the roles are not fixed by gender or by birth, but by the needs of the moment and the unique contributions of the individual. The wisdom of the women was the binding agent of the Scythian circle. It ensured that when the tribe moved, it moved with intention. When it grew with balance, and when it returned to its core. They were the embodiment of the steppe itself, expansive, enduring, and endlessly capable of renewal. If the social circle was the framework of their society, then their approach to resources was the pulse that kept that circle in motion. We have been conditioned by modern life to view trade as a transactional act, a cold, calculated exchange driven by the desire to maximize gain while minimizing cost. We look at the past through the lens of ledgers, searching for evidence of profit margins and market dominance. But to look at the Scythians through this lens is to miss the very heartbeat of their economy. Theirs was not a system of accumulation. It was a system of circulation. It was an economy of gift. To the Scythian mind, wealth was never something to be trapped or kept stagnant. Stagnation, in their worldview, was akin to death. A river that stops flowing ceases to be a river and becomes a swamp. A fire that is not fed dies out. Life itself, their nomadic life, was an ongoing process of movement and exchange. Therefore, to hoard resources was not a sign of security. It was a sign of decay. This philosophy was rooted in their fundamental understanding of the world as a living, interconnected entity. If all things were animated by spirit, if the earth, the animals, and the objects they crafted held a fragment of the sacred, then keeping those things in isolation was a violation of their nature. To give a gift was not merely an act of kindness, it was an act of acknowledgement. It was a way of saying, I recognize that we are part of the same whole, and this exchange honors that connection. When they engaged in trade with the settled civilizations surrounding them, the Greeks of the Black Sea, the Persians to the south, or the myriad tribes of the northern forests, these were never purely economic encounters. They were diplomatic rituals. When a Scythian leader presented a vessel of gold or a finely crafted ornament, they were not offering a commodity. They were offering a piece of their identity, a symbol of their respect, and an invitation to partnership. The expectation in return was not simply a fair price. It was the establishment of a relationship, a bond that would hold even when the tribe moved on and the horizon separated them again. This system of reciprocal exchange created a web of obligation, not of debt. In a transactional society, debt creates resentment. It creates a hierarchy where the debtor is beholden to the lender. In the Scythian gift economy, the act of giving created a web of gratitude. It was an obligation of honor. To receive a gift was to be entrusted with a symbol of the giver's heart, and to return a gift was to acknowledge that trust. It created a society where everyone was continually invested in the well-being of others, because the health of the individual was inextricable from the generosity of the community. This radical approach to wealth also served a pragmatic purpose, perfectly adapted to their nomadic existence. If you are constantly on the move, you cannot be burdened by the weight of unnecessary possessions. Accumulation is the enemy of movement. To hold on to too much is to become slow, to become heavy, to become tethered to the earth in a way that prevents you from following the rhythm of the seasons. Generosity, then, was their ultimate survival strategy. By giving away what they did not need, they traveled light. By sharing what they had, they cultivated a portable form of wealth, the good graces, the friendship, and the respect of those they encountered across the steppe. This teaches us a profound lesson about the nature of prosperity. We often equate wealth with the volume of what we own. We measure our success by the magnitude of our surplus. The Scythians measured their success by the capacity of their circulation. A wealthy person in their eyes was not the one who had the largest pile of gold. It was the one whose life allowed the most goodness to flow through them. They understood that the true security of a human being is not found in a hoard, but in the strength of the community that surrounds them. As we imagine the scenes of these exchanges, perhaps beneath the vast open sky, with the smoke of 100 fires rising in the distance, we can see the serenity of the practice. There is no urgency in their movements. There is no anxiety about losing a margin or failing to get the better end of a deal. There is only the quiet, rhythmic act of sharing. The golden objects change hands, the stories are told, the bonds are strengthened, and the caravan moves on. They were a people who navigated the world with a sense of sufficiency. They were never poor, for they lived in a world that provided for them, and they were never rich in the way that burdens the soul, for they lived in a world that encouraged them to give. They lived in a beautiful paradox. They were the masters of the steppe, yet they claimed ownership over nothing. They were the architects of a complex social tapestry, yet they lived with the lightness of the wind. Their economy was a final, elegant expression of the nomadic rhythm. It was the material reflection of their spiritual belief that nothing is owned, only experienced. In the end, the gold that they crafted did not define them. The gold was merely the medium for the conversation. The conversation, the ongoing, shifting, generous dance of human connection, was the true treasury of the Scythian people.
We have explored the Scythian soul through the intimacy of their art, the strength of their social bonds, and the philosophy of their daily life. But there is another dimension to their existence that is equally profound, one that transformed them from the inhabitants of a landscape into the architects of an era. For centuries, the vast, undulating expanse of the Eurasian steppe was not a barrier to be feared or a wasteland to be crossed. It was the global artery of the ancient world, and the Scythians were the ones who kept its heart beating. When we map the ancient world, we often see civilizations in isolation, the Greeks on their rocky peninsula, the Persians in their river valleys, the Chinese behind their protective barriers. We see them as separate, distinct entities, as if they existed in silos. But the reality of the ancient world was far more fluid, far more interconnected, and it was the Scythians who made this connectivity possible. They were the great bridge builders of antiquity, the silent conduits through which the aspirations of the East flowed toward the West, and the innovations of the West traveled to the distant East. To understand their role, we must first change how we visualize the steppe. It was not a static, empty space. It was a dynamic, living highway. It was a space defined by the ease of movement, by the lack of boundaries, and by the constant, rhythmic circulation of peoples, ideas, and technologies. The Scythians did not just live on this highway, they embodied it. They were the masters of movement, the experts of traversal. They understood the terrain better than anyone else, and they possessed the ability to navigate its vast distances with a precision that bordered on the miraculous. But their role went far beyond logistics. To be a conduit is a creative act. It is not just about moving objects from one place to another. It is about facilitating a synthesis. When a Scythian traveler, having crossed thousands of miles of open sky and undulating grass, met a trader from the Mediterranean, they were not just swapping goods. They were swapping worlds. They were sharing a perspective on the cosmos, a technique for working metal, a way of understanding the movement of the stars, or a story about the origin of the spirits. In this constant exchange, the Scythians were the ultimate translators. They translated the complex technologies of the settled world into the practical, portable needs of the nomadic life, and they translated the profound, quiet wisdom of the steppe into the ambitious, outward-looking cultures of the cities. They acted as a filter, distilling the essential from the superfluous, and ensuring that only the most resilient, the most transformative, and the most universally applicable ideas were carried forward. The steppe was a crucible. In this vast, open space, ideas from different corners of the world met, collided, blended, and were reborn. The Scythians were the catalysts of this process. They took the artistic sensibilities of the Orient and the aesthetic structures of the West and fused them into a new, vibrant visual language, the Scythian animal style, that resonated with cultures thousands of miles apart. They took the metalworking techniques developed in the heart of Asia and brought them to the workshops of the Black Sea, elevating the craft of both regions. This was not an accidental byproduct of their nomadic life. It was a defining characteristic of their culture. They understood that to live on the steppe was to live in the center of a grand, unfolding conversation. They were never insulated from the rest of the world. They were always at the heart of it. They facilitated a level of global interconnectedness that we often mistakenly assume is a unique achievement of the modern age. But long before the first transcontinental empires were forged, long before the establishment of formal trade routes, the Scythians were already ensuring that the world was speaking to itself. They were a people who recognized that the true power of a civilization is not found in the territory it holds, but in the connections it maintains. By being the bridge, by being the conduit, they achieved a form of influence that was far more enduring than any border. They helped build the world that existed before they were gone, a world that was richer, more diverse, and more deeply integrated because of their presence. They were the silent architects of an era of convergence, ensuring that the ancient world was never truly alone. How does one navigate a world without a common written language? How does one communicate deep values, shared myths, and complex ideas when the spoken languages are as vast and varied as the landscape itself? The Scythians faced this challenge every day, and their solution was as elegant as it was profound. They communicated through the language of objects. They were, in the truest sense, the silent linguists of the ancient world. When we examine the artifacts they left behind, the gold, the bronze, the wood, the bone, we are looking at a vocabulary. Every piece, from the smallest belt buckle to the most intricate ornamental shield cover, was a carefully constructed statement. It was a piece of cultural translation designed to be read, understood, and appreciated by people who may have lived thousands of miles away and spoke an entirely different tongue. The Scythian animal style was their primary medium of communication. It was not just art, it was a complex system of semiotics. When they depicted a deer, a lion, a bird, or a horse, they were not just representing an animal. They were articulating a relationship. They were expressing a philosophy of interconnectedness, a respect for the power of the living world, and a recognition of the spirit that animated all of creation. These were not just ornaments, they were ambassadors. Imagine a Scythian ornament reaching a craftsman in the distant forests of the north, or a merchant in a bustling southern marketplace. Even if the person who found it could not read a single word of the language spoken by the creator, they could read the object. They could feel the intention behind it. They could grasp the reverence for the animal, the fluidity of the movement, the elegance of the design. They could understand that this was a culture that held a profound respect for the world it inhabited. This was the power of their silent translation. By stripping away the barriers of grammar and vocabulary, the Scythians communicated on a level that bypassed the intellect and spoke directly to the intuition. They created a shared visual culture that transcended ethnic and linguistic boundaries. They fostered a sense of common humanity, a recognition that regardless of the origin, regardless of the lifestyle, regardless of the language, there were core truths about the world that could be shared and celebrated. This approach had a transformative effect on the regions they touched. As their objects spread, they influenced the artistic styles of the cultures that encountered them. We see this influence in the metalwork of the north, in the jewelry of the south, and in the ornamental motifs of the east. They were not imposing their style, they were offering a new way of seeing, They were providing a visual framework that allowed these other cultures to express their own experiences more clearly. This is the hallmark of a true conduit. A conduit does not leave a mark of dominance. It leaves a mark of enrichment. The Scythians did not seek to overwrite the cultures they interacted with. They sought to connect them. They provided the threads that allowed these diverse societies to begin weaving a larger, more inclusive narrative. But this silent linguistics also extended beyond art. It was found in the way they conducted themselves, their hospitality, their rituals of bonding, their respect for the sacred sites they encountered. These were all silent statements. They communicated through presence and practice. They showed other cultures that it was possible to live with integrity in a world of constant movement, that it was possible to maintain one's identity while remaining open to the world, and that it was possible to treat the landscape with a respect that transcended mere utility. In this way, they were the architects of a unique form of cultural diplomacy. They did not need treaties to establish peace, for they had established a shared understanding. They did not need walls to enforce their values, for they had made those values visible in the objects they left in their wake. They demonstrated that the most effective way to communicate is not to force your truth upon others, but to share a perspective that invites others to see the truth for themselves. They were the silent linguists, the masters of the unsaid, the bridge builders who taught the ancient world how to converse without a common language. They proved that if you have a message that is rooted in the shared experience of being alive, a message of respect for the world, of the value of connection, and of the necessity of balance, you do not need a written word to make yourself understood. You only need a piece of art, a gesture of respect, and a willingness to encounter the other with an open heart. As we reach the final stage of our exploration of the Scythian conduit, we must ask ourselves, what remains of this legacy? They were a people who left no permanent cities, no massive monuments to their own ego, no singular written record to defend their name. They lived, they traveled, they interacted, and then, as the currents of history shifted, they gradually faded into the silence of the steppe. But to conclude that they vanished is to misunderstand the nature of their contribution. They did not leave us walls, they left us the memory of the connection. They left us the knowledge that the world has always been a more integrated, more fluid, and more imaginative place than we care to admit. Their legacy is not an object or a site. It is a way of understanding the potential of the world when we choose to reach across our boundaries. The Scythians taught us that the steppe, far from being an empty space, was a catalyst for the human spirit. They demonstrated that distance is not an obstacle to be overcome, but an opportunity to be explored. They showed us that when civilizations are allowed to breathe, when they are given the space to interact, to trade, and to share their deepest aspirations, the result is not fragmentation, but a more profound, a more vibrant, and a more resilient form of unity. This legacy of connectivity is perhaps their most enduring gift. Even today, as we struggle to navigate a world that is more interconnected than ever, we can find wisdom in the Scythian example. They remind us that true connectivity is not just about the exchange of information or the flow of goods. It is about the exchange of perspectives, the sharing of the sacred, and the commitment to a shared responsibility for the world we inhabit. They remind us that the connections that matter most are those that are built on mutual respect, those that recognize the inherent value in the other, and those that are nurtured through the quiet, consistent act of showing up, of sharing, and of moving forward together. When we look at the artifacts of their golden age, the intricate, delicate metalwork, the objects that speak of a deep reverence for the animal spirit, we are not just looking at relics of a lost time. We are looking at a blueprint for a different kind of relationship with the world. We are looking at a model for a civilization that measures its success not by what it dominates, but by what it facilitates. We are looking at the evidence that it is possible to live in the world without seeking to conquer it, to belong to a community without losing one's own identity, and to move across the landscape without leaving a scar upon its heart. The Scythians were a people who understood the beauty of the temporary. They lived in a world where everything was in flux, where the wind changed, where the seasons turned, and where the horizon was always moving. Yet, They found a way to root themselves in the enduring values of respect, of generosity, and of interconnectedness. They were the masters of the fleeting moment, and in doing so, they created something that has transcended time itself. As we bring this act to a close, as we contemplate the great crossroads that they maintained, let us reflect on the power of their silence, the eloquence of their art, and the profundity of their connection. Let us realize that their journey was not about reaching a destination, it was about the act of reaching itself. They were the ones who kept the world talking, the ones who ensured that the distant could become familiar, and the ones who taught us that the only true boundary is the one we draw around our own imaginations. Their influence remains in the way we now understand the history of human exchange. They have fundamentally altered our understanding of the ancient world, forcing us to move beyond the narrow focus on empires and states, and to recognize the importance of the networks, the conduits, and the people who made them work. They are the invisible thread that ties the history of the East to the history of the West, the quiet, persistent pulse of an interconnected humanity that has always existed, waiting to be rediscovered. They were, and they remain, the poets of the steppe. They were the ones who saw the world not as a collection of parts, but as a living, breathing, moving, and beautiful whole. And in their journey, they have left us with the most important question of all. How will we choose to connect? How will we choose to be the conduit for the world we hope to see? They have given us the bridge, they have shown us the path, and now, it is for us to decide how we will carry the rhythm forward. The physical presence of the Scythian people has long since dissolved into the vast, undulating expanse of the Eurasian steppe. The hearth fires that once glowed like fallen stars against the twilight have been extinguished, and the vibrant, golden caravan that moved in rhythm with the seasons has passed into the realm of memory. There are no crumbling fortresses to mark their sovereignty, no massive monuments of stone to proclaim their longevity, and no singular written record to defend their name against the tides of time. And yet, in the profound silence of the steppe, they are not gone. If you stand today upon those endless plains, where the horizon bends to meet the earth in a seamless embrace, you can still feel the lingering resonance of their passage. It is in the way the wind moves through the tall grass, a whisper that speaks of journeys taken and cycles honored. It is in the way the light catches the distant ridges at sunset, a fleeting flicker of gold that recalls the artistry they once brought into the world. They have become part of the land itself, their spirit woven into the very fabric of the landscape they once called home. Their legacy is not a weight that anchors us to the past, it is a lightness that invites us to imagine the future. They have left us a perspective, a way of seeing the world that remains as relevant today as it was in the height of their golden age. They taught us that security is not found in possession, but in connection. They showed us that true strength is not measured by the boundaries we enforce, but by the generosity we cultivate. And they reminded us that life, when lived in alignment with the rhythms of the earth, is not a struggle against the current, but a graceful dance with the flow of existence. As we look back upon their tapestry, the nomadic rhythm, the art of the soul, the sacredness of the circle, the wisdom of the women, and the economy of the gift, we begin to realize that the Scythians were not just an ancient culture. They were a meditation on what it means to be human in a world that is always in motion. They were a testament to the idea that it is possible to live with integrity in a world that is always changing, to maintain one's own heart while remaining open to the world, and to find the sacred in the mundane, everyday acts of living. Their echo is a soft, persistent call. It calls to the part of us that remembers how to travel light. It calls to the part of us that longs for a connection to the living world that is not mediated by screens or driven by transactions. It calls to the part of us that understands that time is not a straight, relentless line, but a wheel, a breathing, cyclical process that invites us to pause, to breathe, and to find our own balance. As we bring this journey to a close, let the story of the Scythians settle into the quiet spaces of your own life. Let their golden spirit be a reminder that even in our modern, frantic world, there is a nomadic rhythm available to us if we are willing to seek it. There is a way to move through the world with grace, to treat the land with respect, and to value the connections we build over the things we accumulate. The steppe remains, as it always has, a teacher of vastness and a sanctuary of spirit. The echoes are there if you are quiet enough to hear them. They tell us that we are all part of the same grand, unfolding conversation. They tell us that we are all travelers on this earth, moving for a brief moment across the golden fields of existence, and they leave us with a final, lingering truth that the journey is the only destination that ever truly mattered. May you carry the lightness of their wisdom with you. May you find your own rhythm, your own circle, and your own way to contribute to the tapestry of the world. And may you always remember that, like the Scythians before us, we are here not to own the world, but to experience it, to honor it, and to pass the story on.